He thinks what you need to integrate the latest science with the philosophical knowledge of free will is understanding how in the history of evolution, living things develop increasing degrees of what you might call self-regulation. They regulate their nutrition, they regulate their emotion, they regulate their, ultimately they regulate their cognition of the world, which is what human beings distinctively can do.
It's not that you can read off the existence of free will or the possibility of free will from the fact that certain interpretations of quantum mechanics are indeterministic. It can open the possibility space for thinking about causation, so that you're not forced to think about causation one way or another by fundamental physics or the latest trendy physics.
Here is where he's best, is understands about how in biology and in other kinds of cases we're talking about systems, there are all kinds of causal laws that are about the wholes and how the wholes function. And that background is what then opens up the space to understand the kind of causation that happens in living things and then in human mind.
Determinists are essentially giving us a sort of just so story, right? When they say like everything is determined by a prior cause, what's the evidence for that? Well, the evidence for that is that you can predict things. And if you show like, well, there are actually things you cannot predict. Welcome to ARI Bookshelf, a podcast of the Ayn Rand Institute. I'm Tristan Liège, postdoctoral fellow at the Institute. And with me are Ben Bayer, fellow at the Ayn Rand Institute, and Mike Mazza, associate fellow at the Ayn Rand Institute, and Greg Salmieri, a senior fellow at the Civitas Center at the University of Texas at Austin. Thank you for joining me. Today we're discussing the book Free Agents: How Evolution Gave Us Free Will by Kevin Mitchell. Mitchell is a professor of genetics and neuroscience, and his book aims to offer a defense of free will based in scientific perspectives, specifically on biology, physics, and neuroscience. So I'd like to really briefly summarize Mitchell's argument just to orient us here. So his main thesis is that free will is a real emergent property of evolved biological organisms. And Mitchell takes his main opponent to be the idea of determinism, the idea that in some form or for some reason, every event is necessarily caused by a prior event or by a prior state, and that therefore there's no such thing as genuine agency. There's no such thing as genuine choice. There's no such thing as our having genuine control over our actions or our minds. And to do that, what Mitchell does is he provides a very interesting summary and story of how the agency develops and evolves in biological organisms, from the lowest levels of really basic kinds of discrimination and locomotion, all of the way up to human agency, which is deliberative and reflective. And along the way, Mitchell provides a really interesting defense and exploration of what kinds of examples and studies people often cite as refutations of free will. So, for example, the idea that our behavior is determined by our genetics, or that neuroscience experiments show that we don't actually have genuine control over our actions, or the idea that our reasons for acting are opaque to us, they're not accessible to us. So in providing that, I'm interested in what you guys think about why this book is interesting, why it's worth reading, and what were some of your overall thoughts about it?
Free will's a perennial topic in philosophy, and it's an important thesis in objectivism, or principle of objectivism. And it's something that has a cultural moment. There's been a lot of books about free will in the last, 5-10 years. This, to my mind, was the best of the ones I've read about it recently. In particular, I think he has a kind of healthy perspective on what the real questions here are about free will and causality. And it's, I think, more philosophical than most of what I read from philosophers about it. And it's sort of interestingly trying to integrate some really deep questions about causality in metaphysics and about a philosophy of biology into understanding how human beings and in general life forms can be causes in a different way than the type of causing people have in mind when they are thinking about, billiard balls striking into each other or Newtonian clockworks.
I found it an especially interesting book to read given a number of things about the author. One is that he's a geneticist and a neuroscientist, so he clearly has the scientific chops to be talking about at least many of the scientific issues that this question connects to. So he has a lot of credibility coming into it. And on top of that, unlike a number of the books that have been written in defense of free will in the last 5, 10 years, um, he's writing it from the perspective of someone who is, by all accounts that I can tell, uh, fully secular. He's not trying to give some kind of scientific rationalization for what in the back of his mind is actually a religious doctrine. He's insistent throughout the book that the notion of free will that he's trying to defend is one that he sees as fully naturalistic. It's not some kind of supernatural property, magical property, and in many places he's emphasizing why that's the case and why the kind of supernatural dualistic worldview doesn't even make sense as a grounding for free will. Um, so I found it a breath of fresh air in that regard, especially because it doesn't seem to have been funded by the Templeton Foundation, which is often the organization funding some of the religious apologetic books about free will.
That's true. But in fairness to some of the other books that have been out, Sheldon's book, which you and I talked about on an earlier episode, um, I don't think Sheldon is religious, and it's
That's
certainly not coming forward from the book. I don't know whether any Templeton grounds were involved in his work, but whether they were or not, I think he's coming very much from the kind of worldview that we have in Mitchell in this book. But I just thought this was more convincing on the deeper points. I thought Sheldon was very useful on the some of the more personality points about what role the belief in free will has in mental health, which is connected to Sheldon's work. But this one was, I think, a lot more clarifying on the kind of philosophy of mind issues, and particularly on how those integrate to what's known about the brain.
Agreed.
Yeah, I think for me, the most valuable or interesting part of the book is that, if you think about our knowledge with respect to free will has for quite a while been, we have a philosophical understanding of it, but how does it function neurobiologically? How does it fit into into the kind of picture of the world we have from physics? That's kind of been a kind of stagnant until recently, and now it looks, just from reading Mitchell, like maybe we're finally in a position to have some and take a scientific perspective, maybe even develop a full-fledged theory of the neurobiology and the physical basis of choice. So that was interesting to me to see, like, what's the state of this from somebody who's not trying to eliminate free will, but trying to give a scientific explanation in addition to the philosophical perspective. So.
Well, maybe that's a good opportunity for me to segue to what I thought was an important question to ask about the book, and also just to clarify in the minds of our audience, which is what exactly is the relationship between the philosophical question and the scientific issue here? And I think, do we have free will? Is it how and in what way is it consistent with the law of causality? That is clearly a philosophical question. It certainly connects to and has some kind of implications for science. At the same time, I don't think it's a question that can be answered just with science. And the way that Mitchell writes the book, to me at least, is it's and you guys may have a different view, but I think it's ambiguous what exactly he's trying to do, because there are places in the book where he writes that he's trying to use the science to argue for the existence of free will, um, and that uh, but there are other parts of the books where it sounds more like what he's doing is he's simply trying to reconcile the existing science with what he takes to be the fact of free will. Um, I think he writes more often like the second point than like the first, but there's places where the first comes out. And like I think that the second of trying to reconcile is a much healthier thing to do. I think you the evidence, if you want to call it that, that we have free will is something that's directly introspectable and observable to us, and that's not the kind of thing that can be an illusion. If it's an illusion, then we have to. There's a bigger question about whether we can ever have evidence for anything, because part of what we're doing when we're engaging the project of science is thinking of ourselves as uh, agents who are making choices about what to know and how to believe things. And so there's a way in which free will is just implicit in the practice of science. I don't think this distinction is totally clear to him, but I think a lot of what he's doing you can use as a way of integrating our perspective on ourselves with our scientific view.
I don't think the distinction's totally clear simpliciter, like much less to him. I'm not sure the distinction is right. You first put it in terms of trying to prove free will versus trying to reconcile it with science. And I don't think either of those is either a good thing to do or what he's doing. You later recast the reconcile point in terms of integrating. And I think that is what he's doing. And, whether he's doing it consistently and in every place, and sometimes he veers off, I'm not sure. There are some things that read like arguments for free will in the book, but then they're more philosophical arguments than scientific ones, I think. What I think the reason the term of reconciling feels like a good term to use, though I don't think it quite is right, is that people have a view of science that makes and of causation in science that makes it mysterious how free will could exist. And so you think, how do we bring them back together? But I think really what he's doing is um, integrating free will into a picture of biology and biology's place in the natural world. And he's doing that by kind of retelling the story of evolution and retelling certain facts about physics and how we're understanding causality in physics in a way that then makes it natural to see, well, how can free will come in on the scene? How is there this developing thing, agency, which is a type of causation, distinct from the types of causation that are in view when you're thinking in certain ways in physics, but indeed may be necessary to understand physical systems. And as you kind of bring that in, here's its role in biology, here's how it's different in animals than plants, here's how it's different in more complex animals than simpler animals, here's how it's special in the human case. And I don't think everything about the way he does that is quite right. And I think there are some, at least potential confusions or some things we'd want to kind of sort out more or get more clarity on. But I think the basic kind of trajectory of what he's doing is this kind of reconceptualizing some causal concept, or the way we understand causality in physics and biology in a way that sets the stage for an understanding of how free will can be an evolved a feature of human beings.
Yeah, I'll say for my part, that's how I understand what he's doing too, Ben. And I think y- I think you are right to point out that he's leaning less into he's clearly leaning less into the philosophical debates on free will, and I think um that's actually appropriate given his expertise is on the science. Um but it does raise questions of where does he actually land in the end in terms of if we're trying to pin him down as a philosophical position. um, how would we actually describe it? But I will say I think there are a number of places where he points out, look, the idea of causal determinism is just absurd. Um, but there's still a story. I think his view is there's still a story to be told of like how do we actually conceptualize agency biologically. And I don't the way that he frames it, it doesn't seem to me that he thinks that that's what you need to resolve the absurdity. The absurdity is still there, but there's just a question of how do you frame the science and understand the science in a way that you can avoid being tempted by that absurdity. And I take his stance to be more like that.
One thing was to clarify for the audience before we go forward, is term agency is probably gonna come up a lot in the conversation today, mainly because it's the term that, Mitchell uses throughout the book, and he's using it as a bit of a term of art, I think, because he uses it to mean any action by any living creature. So he doesn't equate it with free will as it could be done. And so when we're talking about his explanation of agency, he's talking about explaining all living action of which he sees human free agency as just one type, but you have to explain the broader genus, he thinks, to make sense of the species.
Yeah, I think there's something both right about that as an approach, and I don't like this using agent to refer to plants and animal. And part of what he's thinking is there's a kind of causation here that fades in, and that the human case is is a kind of um, very complex or paradigm case of something that you see in societies. But I think that is true, but he treats it as, I think, more continuous than I would like to see.
So I think I should mention that, like, one of the things I think I really like about the book is the fact that he thinks what you need to integrate the latest science with the philosophical knowledge of free will is understanding how in the history of evolution, uh, living things develop increasing degrees of what you might call self-regulation. They regulate their nutrition, they regulate their emotion, they regulate their, uh, ultimately, they regulate their cognition of the world, and then are able to engage in metacognition, which is what human beings distinctively can do. And I think that's right. I think that the best way to understand what free will is something like cognitive self-regulation, and it looks a lot less mysterious and integrates with our wider understanding of biology if you see it as simply the most specialized, complex, uh, adaptive version of the same kind of self-regulation all living creatures are engaging in.
We should mention that in using that term cognitive self-regulation, you're referencing the title of a really wonderful paper Harry Binswanger wrote in, was it the 80s?
Late 80s or early 90s.
1991,
The
92.
monist. But I do want to say that there is, if you just say that what living things self-regulate, human beings self-regulate our cognition as well as other things, you can interpret that view in a what's called a compatibilist way. We're still determined, but the determinism involves a system where the system is reinforcing or editing itself, but still in a strictly deterministic way, where the past is just like, couldn't be any other way given the future, couldn't be any other way given the past, etc. Now, that's clearly not Harry's view or objectivism's view. It's also clearly not Mitchell's view. I think he's clear that he does not think the future is determined. He doesn't think it's determined by the past. That there's something wrong in the picture of causality that assumes the past is going to the future is determined by the past, and that free will is part of what we're saying, and that we have free will is that that's not true, which I think is right. That is part of what the claim that we have free will means. But by so likening it to this kind of greater complexity that we find of regulation that we find in biological systems, there's the question of, are all of them like this then? And so, in effect, this type of free will and the future not being set by the past is true of a amoeba and a paramecium or whatever, or it's only true of human beings. Where exactly does it come in, and how does it come in? How continuous or discontinuous is this type of causation? I don't think that question is addressed as squarely as I'd like to see it addressed in a book like this, but I do think part of why the question seems why it seems like it couldn't be there couldn't be this kind of free will in the human case that I think we know we have introspectively, is that people have a picture of causation that rules it out, which picture of causation is wrong, is mistaken, even for fairly simple physical systems, and certainly for complex biological systems. And so seeing how that picture of causation runs out, is just not workable on its own terms, even before we're thinking about free will. I think is really useful for freeing the mind and opening up space for thinking about, okay, well, how does the human type of agency, how does free will, how does this kind of conscious causation fit into the natural world? The natural world doesn't work in this way that some people have thought it did that would rule that out, but then how does it work? But I still think there's not as much about what's distinctive or special about human causation, and the extent to which the metaphysical questions have different answers or don't, but in the human case versus the case of other animals.
Greg, let me make a suggestion about what you said. If he doesn't address the question of whether or not it's just for human choice that the future is not determined. Like, does that apply all the way down and up? This gets to Ben's point about there being a certain ambiguity in his project. Is he trying to reconcile or is he trying to integrate? So if you have more of a view that free will, the existence of free will is a datum or a fact to be explained, then I think that pushes you more in the direction of thinking of, well, then maybe free will should be on a continuum with other biological functions. And then that question kind of, I think, would be more pressing, versus that if what you think you're doing is, well, there's the physics and the biology, there's the existence of free will, and like, how do I make them fit, as opposed to how do I take the fact of free will as a piece of evidence in the very formation of my picture of physical causation and biological causation. So I think that's the fact that it's ambiguous, which is he doing, I think has this kind of effect that, well, for us, where we're more thinking along those lines, that you have to take the existence of free will as a fact in the formation of your biological theories and your picture of physical causation, that kind of question is more easy for us to ask or see the importance of, than if there's a kind of ambiguity. Which am I doing? Am I showing that science proves that there's free will, or am I taking the free will as an established fact to be incorporated?
I don't think it's in range of reasonable interpretations that what he thinks he's doing is showing that science proves that there's free will. He's doing something like helping reframe for you, or in some cases replace for you, your understanding of causality in natural science, with one that is, he thinks, more accurate, and that puts you in a position to see human agency as continuous with a complicated set of natural phenomena, real human agency with real choice that shapes the future, as continuous with a kind of increasingly complex set of natural phenomena that give organisms control over their lives. And
well, you don't think it's a reasonable interpretation that he's doing that as if this is the only reason to think there's free will, but he could also be thinking of it as a kind of convergent argument. Like, there's the scientific case, there's the philosophical case, both of which converge on the existence of free will. I think that's a mistake too. Like, it's not a convergent. Science does not establish the existence of free will as a fact. That is a philosophical issue.
I will say that in terms of the issue of does he frame it too much, your point, Greg, that does he frame it too much as the human agency or human free will is continuous with agency? I think the later chapters in the book are some of the most important chapters and probably the best chapters, because of where he tries to create that difference. And I will say, I think for my part, I felt that he did a pretty good job of that, given that he's not a philosopher. I think he's not really equipped to think about the different philosophical positions on free will in a very robust way. but I do think he makes it pretty clear that free will is a type of agency, but it's a distinct type of agency, and it leads to moral responsibility. And I thought that he could have said more still, but I think the way I understand what he's doing is to point out that, biology doesn't show us that organisms are just mechanisms that are being pursed around, nor are human beings. But he has that passage where he talks about like our minds are set free. He thinks of human free will as a kind of exaptation where it maybe was evolved for a specific biological purpose, but it led to this sort of cognitive open-endedness, where we can be creative and imagine things and create our own reasons and all of that. And I think that was a really crucial part of the book to
I
address what you're talking about.
I do worry about this kind of thing. Is he a philosopher? Is he equipped to do that? Like, it's not like philosophers are any good on this issue. I think he's more philosophical on this than Dan Dennett, who he talks about, who I don't think has anything really interesting to say about free will, but he's often quoted on it. And he's, certainly more interesting and more philosophical and more deeply philosophical than, 90% of philosophers who write on this issue, which isn't that hard to be. Like, the point is that's not a very high bar. Most philosophy on this is quite bad. But also, it's not just that we have the right view on this in our back pockets. Like, it's not, I think we know that there's free will. We know some things about it that are important as philosophical truths. And we know that the right way to understand science is in a way that will let it integrate with that, rather let our understanding of the right way to understand physics and parts of biology has to be ways that integrate with that. And I think we know some things, or I know some things about, the philosophy of causation that kind of sets the stage for that. But that doesn't mean I have, or we have, or anybody has in our back pockets, like exactly how should you understand a dog's consciousness and how it causes things versus a human's, versus a jellyfish's, versus the kinds of things that go on in plants that aren't conscious but aren't this or that. Like that question of what's distinctive about human beings, the kind of conscious causation that happens in us relates to other animals and relates to non-animal things. That is, I think, an open question and a scientific question. So it's not like he'd need to be a philosopher to answer that. It's a scientific question, and it's a scientific question that requires, as all good science does, philosophical guidance and a lot of thinking on the kind of borderline of philosophy and science. And so I think it's good that we have people like this doing it, and we shouldn't interpret them as this poor benighted guy in some science department groping towards the wisdom we as philosophers have, or that some better philosophers than us should work out. The kind of thing he's trying to figure out is a kind of thing that needs to be worked on by people in various sciences and in philosophy.
So let me give an example of a case where I think Mitchell's actually being a better philosopher than most of the philosophers who write about free will, but still with, yes, admittedly, some bit of a answer in the back of my pocket, a suggestion for how he could be even better in the direction he's going. And that's on identifying what kind of the basic locus of free will is. What kind of control over our lives does it consist in? And one place where I think he's very good, where I think a superior philosophic insight comes out, is when he's analyzing the kind of science that's typically used to try to dispute free will. And so here I have in mind the way that he deals with the Benjamin Libet experiments. These are the experiments in neuroscience where people are asked to randomly flick their wrist at a certain time and then report when they remember having made the decision, and the EEG chart suggests that there's a readiness potential rising in their brain before they actually remember making the decision, suggesting that there's some kind of subconscious intention that they didn't even know about that's really driving their decision. And Mitchell's really good on 2 points. One is they come to the same point, realizing that the kind of, quote, decision that the person's making in a case like this is very, very far from the paradigm of what anybody would ordinarily consider to be a free will choice, precisely because they've been explicitly asked to make a random decision. It doesn't matter when they flick their wrist. and that what's closer to the paradigm is actual deliberative decision making. And then he interestingly reports that the people who've done further experimentation where they measure for that same readiness potential in deliberative contexts where it actually matters what decision you make, they don't discover that same readiness potential rising. And so that, to me, that especially since he has this neuroscientific background, that was one of the more interesting and impressive parts of the book, both because he clearly knows the science, but also because he's got a sense of, well, this isn't really what the Lebet experiment was looking at. It's not really the kind of thing people think they have free will control over in the first place. And so he sees deliberation is closer to the relevant locus. And you get even more of that, I think, good philosophical sense when he's pointing out how the kinds of thinking we engage in when we do what he calls metacognition, when we don't just respond to reasons, but we think about our reasons, we evaluate our reasons, we evaluate our level of certainty, whether it's a good enough reason to act when engaging in deliberation, is also philosophically insightful. And he also uses that against various arguments against determinism, like those coming from Sam Harris. Sam Harris says there's cases where you don't know why you choose coffee versus tea. There's experiments in social psychology where people are primed to make certain kinds of decisions and inexplicably pick certain things because of their priming. And I think he rightly points out, just because we don't always know what our reasons for doing things are, doesn't mean that there aren't lots of other cases where we do know what our reasons are, where we're actually even evaluating those reasons. And so, again, I think that's good philosophic sense on his point. This is just closer to the paradigm of what ordinary people regard as the kind of control they have over their lives. And where the only place where I would point to room for improvement is, well, if you are really exercising control over your life as a human agent by taking that kind of epistemic perspective on your reasons, engaging in that kind of metacognitive self-regulation, um, that suggests there's an even more basic kind of regulation that he's not yet considering, which various philosophers have pointed to, which is just the decision whether to exercise that kind of epistemic perspective or not. He mentions William James in various places. There are places where James sees that that's really the issue, the degree of attention you attach to certain kinds of questions. I don't think James fleshes it out fully enough, but then there are other philosophers like Alexander Aphrodisius. Greg, you know a lot about him. You introduced me to him. And of course, Ayn Rand, who sees the free will basically as the choice to focus or not, the choice to think or not. And so I think something like that is implicit in a lot of what he's looking at, but it's worth making more explicit in the end.
And we could add to that pantheon of people who have this type of view. You could see it, if you were to, as anticipations of Rand's view of focus. John Locke, who I think
in certain moments, yeah,
a lot better on this than James is. But in any case, it's a view that's sort of approached often in the history of thought, or at interesting moments. And I think Alexander is the first person to, I think, be a clear, unambiguous advocate, or one of the first, of free will as
choice to deliberate, right?
And as opposed to compatibilism, not just what's called hard determinism. And it's interesting that in these first texts that are laying out this position as opposed to Stoicism, you see this kind of idea. It's free will has to do with deliberation and the fact that it's up to us, even whether we deliberate.
So in that regard, I think he's definitely Mitchell is definitely superior philosophically. I did want to raise a question for general discussion about the way he connects the issue of moral responsibility to free will, and he suggests the way philosophers think about it, in effect, rigs the game too much, assuming that a certain conception of moral responsibility, that is, what makes a person subject to praise or blame by other people, it rigs the game because it builds too many assumptions into what free will has to be to make it, in the way that Dan Dennett puts it, a kind of free will worth wanting. And he in effect says, well, we shouldn't build all those kinds of assumptions in. We should first just think about, do we have this basic control or not? And we can look at implications for moral responsibility later and let the chips fall where they may, in effect. And I think there's something right about what he's saying here, that if you're doing honest philosophy, you don't build a very specific conception of a key philosophical concept into your question to begin with. Um, at the same time, since we're talking about, what do you take as datum here? What do you take as the basic datum that you then try to integrate with, say, the science? I and there's a question here of how much of this datum anybody can be in the position to fully explicate. But I do think it's important that a kind of responsibility uh, has to be seen as a sort of datum in thinking about this question. And it's less what's conventionally regarded as moral responsibility. It's more what I would regard as epistemic responsibility, as the way in which we're responsible for our own thinking, and whether we do it or not, and the kind of norms that come out of that. And that goes back to the point I was making earlier about how there's a certain view of free will that's even implicit in the practice of science. If we trust what scientists say, if we think science is a reliable method, it's because we think there's certain right ways of thinking, certain wrong ways of thinking, if what we want to acquire is the truth. And so I'm a little skeptical about the idea you can just dispense entirely with this robust conception of responsibility in entering into this question. Although it's true that it takes work to even see that that's implicit in the kind of control we have over our cognition.
That's something that follows. That is, responsibility is something that follows from the kind of control that we have over our cognition, not something that's kind of part of what it means to have that kind of control. It's an implication of it. And the way I see it is and then it also depends on what you mean by responsibility. If what you mean by responsibility is just that you're in control, that it's up to you, well, then it's just another term for free will, or something being up to you. But what's meant by it in the literature, what's meant by it, when Dennett talks about it, and which we'll talk about what kind of free will is worth having, is something that embeds you in systems of being subject to praise and blame, and being certain norms can apply to you and so forth. And all of that stuff is one of several important things that are downstream from this basic fact that is implicit in even making a decision and being able to deliberate at all, that you recognize that you are controlling things, that you have control, that things are up to you. And so I think the way he writes about this issue, Mitchell, I think is basically right with respect of to approach. He says, quoting, "Asking what kind of free will we want that will let us maintain our positions on moral responsibility can become almost a theological exercise in motivated reasoning." And I think that's right. It often does become that. It means we are looking for a palatable answer instead of trying to understand what really is. It is coming at the question from the wrong end, picking an answer we like, and seeing what edifice of arguments we need to build support for it. Instead, I would like to know what kind of free will we actually have. But notice he's saying what kind of free will we actually have. So he's not saying, I want to know if we have. There's some phenomenon, namely, I take it that human beings are in control of themselves, and we can tell that we're in control of ourselves in a way that rocks aren't. And we can tell, I think, if we think a little bit about it, that dogs are neither like rocks nor like us. And I think the question he's asking is the question we ought to ask, which is, okay, there's a distinctive type of causality that we are on about here, that we're that's existing in ourselves, that we're aware of, that is one of the factors into our practices of praise and blame, but not the other, or the only one. And we want to understand what that mode of causation is and how it fits in the world. And I that's very much my way of coming at this question. I don't think he's denying that it's super important for all kinds of other things, but I think he's pushing back against the way compatibilists pose the question. And I think he's right to push back about those.
But can I raise a question about that? Ben and Greg, since you're having sort of a disagreement, it sounds like. So the Well, I take Greg's point that a lot of the or most of the things that we talk about under the heading of responsibility are like implications or doubt or further inferences. But what relevance does that have for the question about whether or not those implications should factor in as evidence for some kind of theorizing about, well, I guess it would depend on what you're theorizing about. So if it's about um, the right view of causation, then maybe that those implications aren't you wouldn't take them as evidence or data. But if it's something like um, a psychological theory of choice, then maybe that sounds plausible to me, that those implications about responsibility and praise and blame that we can get by inference from some kind of basic introspection would be fair game as data. What do you think about that?
I mean, part of what makes me think that certain aspects of a conception of responsibility have to be taken as a kind of datum is that, well, the main thing I have in mind is something like normativity, like that you can regard certain ways of thinking as rational and certain ways of thinking as irrational. And I mean, I guess in favor of what Greg is saying, like in the history, the development of human thought, you don't start with the conception of any kind of epistemic norms. But I guess my view is that once we have them, as we do in a modern industrial scientific civilization, and to the extent that we think we understand them, I don't think you can throw out the fact that there's a difference between rationality and irrationality. That is so closely connected to our epistemic agency that I think you in fact have to treat it as a datum to reconcile, to integrate with everything else you know about science.
The way I think about it is this is that we have this kind of choice and that we're accessible for it. So that we have this kind of choice is one of the things that is presupposed by um, these norms. And it's not that we know that we have the kind of choice because we know that there are these norms, and so these norms are the data for it. It's rather we wouldn't know that we had these norms unless we already knew that we have these kinds of choices that make us answerable to norms, that are presupposed in being answerable to norms. So it's never the case that you argue from the norms to or from the held accountable to them, the fact that you can be held accountable to norms, to the fact that you have the choices that enable you to be held accountable to norms. That's like a Kantian transcendental argument. And that's not how it is. You can point out the fact that you are already presupposing that you have this kind of choice by pointing out that that's presupposed in applying the norms, and the norms are inherent in thinking. But that's a kind of reaffirmation through denial argument. It's not an argument that the norms are the data.
Yeah.
Data is the understanding of oneself as having choice.
Yes.
And the experience of oneself as a chooser, and what it's like to make a choice. And I think that's the basic thing, not the norm. It's just the norms are so quickly follow on that. So
yeah, that's helpful. So it's the kinds of the reaffirmation through denial, or pointing out that presuppositions of your discourse include the basic fact, is more about showing that it's basic than that it's a fact.
That it's a fact. Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, so I think this is a good segue to discussing some of the broader issues that Mitchell touches on with regard to causality and how he understands certainly the state of physics and what it can tell us about how we think about causal determinism, and the idea that, um, for example, lower level systems or lower level particles or entities fully determine the states and events that happen at higher levels. So one of the, I think, interesting questions that's raised by Mitchell in this book is, what's his general understanding of causality, and what does he take determinism to be getting wrong in terms of how they think about what causality is?
Well, one thing that comes up in these debates, I think, too much, is invoking quantum indeterminacy to kind of settle some issue. And I think Mitchell, what he's doing is the right way to think of it. So it's not that you can read off the existence of free will or the possibility of free will from the fact that certain interpretations of quantum mechanics are indeterministic. What the importance of the quantum mechanics stuff is that can open the possibility space for thinking about causation, so that you're not forced to think about causation one way or another by fundamental physics or the latest trendy physics or whatever. That there's deterministic interpretations of quantum mechanics, there's indeterministic interpretations of quantum mechanics, and then as I think Greg wants to talk about, there's kind of ways to think about physics that's not uh, um, let's put it as part to part, but whole to part and part to whole. That the importance of the physical science he brings up is just opening up the possible ways to think about what kind of causation do we find in nature. It's not just limited to billiard balls banging into each other. I think that's the right way to the right respect in which to raise issues about the interpretation of quantum mechanics. Not that it's, oh, there's quantum indeterminacy, therefore, things are random, so maybe free choice is randomness. That's not the right.
Yeah, I think to build on that, Mike, I think part of what's really interesting in how he develops that is it doesn't come, and I think this is in the vein of what you're saying, is that it doesn't come across as he's trying to use quantum mechanics to say, oh, well, there's randomness in the universe, so let's like immediately tie that into human agency, as like that proves that determinism can't be true of human beings. But he's trying to motivate it more by showing how there are reasons to think that indeterminacy happens in other places, and it has actual explanatory power. For example, he ties it into how variability is important for the evolution of organisms, that they need to have some way of accessing randomness. So I thought that was a really interesting aspect of how he talked about those issues, that it, to your point, it felt motivated, like he wasn't trying to just use it to respond to a specific argument, but he was trying to actually motivate in explanatory terms, like why we should reject this picture of causal determinism, and specifically the idea, the reductionistic version of it, the idea that simpler or lower level things um, always determine or fully determine the states and actions and events that happen at higher levels.
There was the way you put it a moment ago, Mike, was that the quantum mechanics, science of the very small, is useful for opening up space for how to think about causation. And I think there's something right about that, though I should, step back and connect back to the discussion we were having before about what's your data in philosophy. And now I think that just the fact of your own agency is also an important data for thinking about causation. You shouldn't even need to look at the different ways causation is dealt with in science. Science is just a hyper specialized, self-conscious perspective on the same kind of data that you have when you introspect, and also when you extrospect. So, but what's true is
Well,
that
that's both a polemical, like there's a polemical element in that if we're talking about the invocation of physics to make one point or another, but there's another, like if you really want to integrate the fact of free will with the physics, you
right.
need to talk about what the content of the physics is, and to say that you can just read determinism off physics is not true.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say is what's true is when there's questions about what does the science even say about causation. The fact that there's not an obviously deterministic view of the universe uh, implied by the latest modern science, it's very useful and relevant to look at what's happening with quantum physics.
A few thoughts about this. He's very sensitive to the point that just saying there's randomness doesn't get you free will. If we act at random because some atom in us swerves, there's some quantum determinacy in my indeterminacy in my neural cortex, and that's why I just get up and start dancing. That's not free will. And this is a point that people have made a lot. So his point isn't that, we can somehow save freedom by quantum, randomness or something like that, because it wouldn't be freedom. What he's saying is that and this is a point I should mention, I first encountered in John Searle, but who died recently, a philosopher. But Mitchell develops it, I think, in a lot more detail here, and I don't know if he got it from Searle or maybe other people have said it in between. But that what the indeterminacy, or in general confusingness, that we're finding about how quantum systems behave, that they're not easy to understand in straightforwardly deterministic terms, is that there's something important we don't understand about the physical systems here. And that's the thing that opens our mind. If you thought you understood exactly how every part of you worked and exactly what it would do in every situation, and what you know about how every part of you works and what it would do in every situation would rule out your ever making a choice, and yet you seem to make a choice, well, then there's some contradiction. Either you're wrong that you make a choice, or you're wrong about something about how the parts of you work. And the claim is that we're wrong about something about how the parts of us work. That needs to be rethought. The point isn't necessarily even that it's random, it's that it's this mechanistic view of it isn't quite right. And I think what you really need, in essence, to understand free will is to understand how wholes can be causes of features of their parts. And that you don't understand the causation as systems can be causes of how the things within the systems function. You need more than that to understand what's distinctive about human free will. But if you're lacking the idea that a whole could ever cause anything about its parts, you think the parts could only cause things about the whole, then you don't have any place in your causal theory for how a choice made by an organism, or a thing known by an organism, even if it's not by choice, could cause the organism to do what it does. All you have room for is like the firing of this neural cell can cause that, but you don't have room for how something at the level of the organism as a whole could cause the organism to do anything. Or how talking about that, something at the organism as a whole, can be anything other than a shorthand for explaining the real causality, which happens at the level of the itty-bitty parts. And what we get in Mitchell, I think here is where he's best, is understanding about how in biology and then other kinds of cases where we're talking about systems, there are all kinds of causal laws that are about the wholes and how the wholes function. You couldn't possibly understand them if you just thought in terms of the parts. The reason why the eye evolved isn't about this gene doing that thing or this molecule doing that or whatever, that you could look at molecule by molecule. It's about like a selection pressure that exists at the level of organisms and populations of organisms in an environment. You have to be thinking about that whole system to understand the causality at place. And it's not just to understand it. The causality is something that happens at that system's level, at the levels of those wholes interacting. And whatever is true about the parts and bits and genes and molecules in the genes and atoms in the molecules and so forth, is not the whole causal story. It's a part of the causal story. And then there's this particular view about how it involves randomness and how it involves randomness interacting with constraints on the systems, that the system could have a deterministic causal path even when the little things don't. But that's the kind of thinking about wholes that you kind of need to engage in to understand lots of stuff in biology, lots of stuff in complicated chemistry and so forth, and that background is what's then opens up the space to understand the kind of causation that happens in living things and then in human minds as some type of that, and some special case of that.
Basically, that it's important that the kind of top-down causation that he's discussing here is, by his own account, this is something that's not just about free will. This is something he thinks applies across the whole biological realm. Whenever you're talking about functional logical explanation, this is one of the things I think he's really good at, is seeing how you can't make sense of biological explanation without talking about purposes and goals, not necessarily in a conscious sense if you're talking about non-conscious organisms, but in a non-conscious, wider teleological sense. Something he seems to get a lot from Terence Deacon's view about, we're going to be talking about Deacon's book in a later bookshelf. But then to get us back to the question about quantum physics, there's a it seems like there's at least one interpretation of quantum mechanics where there's a missed opportunity for him to talk about the role of top-down causation, and that's the Bell theorem issue that I know that Mike wanted to say something about.
Well, yeah. So I think he kind of misses the lesson from the Bell's theorem. So in his telling,
Well,
he thinks,
remind us what that is for sure.
yeah. So the theorem itself is this theorem that under certain circumstances there'll be a correlation between the outcomes of experiments that couldn't exist if it were true that there can be no superluminal interactions or causation between anything.
And superluminal meaning faster than the
Faster than light, in violation of special relativity, etc. And that the experimental probings of this have shown that it's the quantum mechanical predictions, that is the violations of what's called Bell locality, that no faster than light interactions, has been seemingly experimentally confirmed that this is a feature of nature. And he takes the lesson of that to be, well, this rules out deterministic interpretations of quantum mechanics. And I don't think that's the lesson. So one, I don't think that's true. There are deterministic, there remain deterministic interpretations of quantum mechanics that include this kind of non-local superluminal interaction.
Notary David Bohm, right?
Yeah, the David Bohm, which Bell himself was positive towards. But the other possibility is that not that there's some kind of superluminal interaction between very distant things, but a kind of I don't know what to call it, uh, spread outiness of things, such that there's not one thing traveling from A to B, but there's just some really large thing that moves as a whole. So that there's all kind of possibilities for wholes to interact with parts that should be explored. I mean, that to me, that's one of the possibilities opened up by this physics. And I mean, going back to what Greg was saying earlier about systems or wholes influencing parts, I think it's significant that even though it's very perspicuous that that's the way to understand complex biological and chemical systems, that's what's going on with even microphysics and just ordinary non-biological, non-chemical physics too, is that there's some degree of hold apart causation going on. It's just that we usually abstract away from that in formulated fundamental physics. So
This is out of my range of thought, but isn't the name of the phenomenon that's established by these experiments quantum entanglement?
yeah, entanglement. Yeah,
The concept of that's the more or less theory neutral name. Like, how do you explain quantum entanglement? Is it in this Bohmian way?
these correlations and
Right. But the idea of entanglement is that things that might have
kinds
from one another are connected. They move together. They work together. And the general phenomenon of entanglement points to things that you might have thought were disparate are connected. And then the question is to just how are they connected? How are they somehow one? Is it do they send a signal to each other faster than light, or is it that this or is it that? Maybe they're just somehow one big field or one big thing. Who knows? Maybe someone will figure it out. But the general point is there's a kind of situations in which we thought we could see things as separate little bits, but we now recognize that we have to see them as connected. And maybe there are a lot of other cases like that. The other kinds of things that the systems views are important on is there are lots of cases where maybe the little stuff turns out to work with some randomness in it. Maybe it doesn't. But whether it's deterministic or random, it might as well be random within some level of variance for our causal theory. It doesn't matter exactly. You understand understanding the ideal gas laws or whatever doesn't depend on knowing the exact trajectory of a billion little molecules. It depends on knowing that the energy level and amount of motion in the place where the molecules are will go up when a heat source is applied. And you don't understand that sort of molecule by molecule. You understand that at the level of the populations of molecules, not, each trajectory one by one. And so there's this issue of there's a perspective one can take on physical laws that's too discrete bit by bit, not appreciating that a lot of the knowing that we already have, even in paradigm physics, without bringing in more exotic and recent physics, um, underemphasizes the knowledge of structure and connectedness and things like that. And this is, I think there's something right about that way of thinking about causality, and there's something right about thinking about that's what's involved in any case where you are figuring out how to integrate something that seemed unintegratable by earlier science. Like there was something wrong with the way the two domains are being thought about. If you know they're both real and it seems like they can't be integrated, but you have a reason to think they have to both be, like something's wrong with how we were thinking about one or the other or both of them before. The classic case in the history of thought that I think one should think about for integrating things that seemed like they didn't integrate is Newton's integration of superlunary and sublunary motion. So there was this idea in the old Aristotelian science that everything down here goes up or down. It's either heavy and it goes down or it's light and it goes up. But the things in the heavens, they don't go up or down, they go around. So they must be made of something else that's around going stuff. And Newton's laws of motions are universal laws of motion because they explain both how the stars move and how apples fall, right? How the moon moves and how apples fall. It cuts through this idea of sublunary and superlunary motion and integrates all motion. But part of what you need to get to something like that is, apples don't fall exactly how we thought. And things on Earth don't move. It's not like they go up until they tire of it and they go down. They move in parabolic arcs. And why are they parabolic? Like there's a kind of noticing that there's something too pat and not quite right about the earlier causal story as applied even to the kind of simple cases of it, that you then see, oh, like we weren't quite understanding this right. And once we understand it properly, we see that there are reasons to think that things that seemed like they had to be totally separate from it, like say how minds work compared to how bodies work, don't have to be so totally separate. There's ways that you couldn't have pre-predicted to integrate them that open up once you break the stranglehold of a false too simple theory of how they move.
Greg, that reminds me of a conversation we were having earlier that I want to ask you more about, because you had said this is a strategy for how to try to integrate things that didn't look like they were integratable, in particular, a finding of older previous science that doesn't seem to, in this case, integrate with free will. And you had a point about uh, the whole genesis of the deterministic worldview in the first place, and whether it's even really, say, Newtonian science that's really the impetus behind that worldview, or whether it goes back to something else. And could you just tell us more about, because that was a fascinating point that you made on that subject.
There have always essentially been two arguments for determinism. One argument is that God knows the future, and God can't know the future unless there's already a fact of the matter about what the future is. So God knows what you're going to do, and therefore you got to do that thing, right? That's the divine kind of argument. And the other is that the latest up-to-date physics proves to us that there's a kind of chain of cause and effect that you can't break, and therefore the future is determined by the past. But what's interesting about that second argument, the latest up-to-date physics, is that it's thousands of years old. And all the details of the physics have changed, but the arguments never shifted. That is, the Stoics think this. Everything's interpenetrating fluids, and the interpenetrating fluids have to move in just and so a way, and therefore there's a chain going from the past to the present, and it can't possibly be broken. And nobody thinks there are interpenetrating fluids. But it turns out whether you think there are interpenetrating fluids, or whether you think there are atoms, or whether you think there are atoms in the sense that some atomists meant, but in another sense, like they all have to be this chain that's unbreakable from the past to the future. So it's not actually any actually scientifically established particular fact that's ever done any of the work in establishing determinism. It's some kind of habit of thought that's associated with physics, or some way of interpreting physics. That's not to say it's not true. I think it's false, but the point is that it's not like, oh, well, Newton discovered this or whatever. Now, I do think there are types of explanation that when you notice you could explain a lot with them, get very exciting to people and orient people towards certain habits of thought that can be sort of overgeneralized or thought to be all there is about the relevant thinking, and so can reinforce deterministic thinking. But again, it's not something that actually follows from the physics. And so Newton is an important moment of it. By thinking of things in certain kind of mechanistic terms, he explained quite a lot. And then I think people over had a wrong philosophical gloss on how those explanations worked and thought they could explain things that they didn't, and then ruled out the mind. And you get the same thing happening in pre-Socratic science, where by Anaxagoras, scandalously thought the moon was a rock and so forth, and thinking the moon was a rock and the sun was a fiery ball, was able to explain things like eclipses, and his explanation of eclipse was basically right. There's a light source and something blocking it and whatever. But you can get too sort of overexcited about what's accomplished by saying what things are made of, and think you could explain everything in terms of what things are made of, and then you miss out on a lot of how we explain and understand things, on what causes are, and even on how those explanations of the eclipse and things work. If you think everything's just what it's made of, because it's not just what it's made of, it's also like what angles the things are standing at to one another, and geometrical facts and facts about optics and so forth that are involved in explaining an eclipse. And why do I bring up this example? Well, what happened in Aristotle, what Aristotle's kind of revolution in science is incorporating a lot of what was discovered or thought by these pre-Socratic philosophers who were naturalists and who thought a lot about materials, right? Incorporating their insights, but into a more complicated causal story, where he understood cause and effect by extended analogy from how we understood deliberative artistic working. An artist who by his mind makes something works in a certain way. And he didn't think nature worked like an artist. He didn't think there were conscious intentions behind nature. He didn't think that there's a God who plans things and executes it that way. But he thought by extending, coming up with more abstract causal models of causal reasoning based on the human case, we could kind of extend it and come up with concepts to understand things in the natural world. And so then you get Aristotelian causal theory, where you have formal causes and efficient causes understood as things that impose forms on stuff that's able to take on other forms and so forth. And you have Aristotelian science, which really makes possible and launches the field of biology and a lot of other things, but which gets quite a lot wrong in terms of understanding elements and the laws of motion. And it's from Aristotle's system that we get these sublunary and superlunary distinction and so forth. So now you get in the modern world with the birth of modern science, replacing of a lot of the physics kind of material in Aristotle, the material that he inherited from the pre-Socratics, right, or some of it from the pre-Socratics, with a much better, more correct, more causally powerful understanding of what kind of simple bodies there are and how they move and what laws govern the motion of bodies as such. But you get associated with that this idea that maybe we could explain everything just with respect to the principles of how bodies as such move and attract each other and repel each other like a clockwork. And I think what we're seeing a lot now in the philosophy of biology and in some other fields in philosophy of science is, and indeed in philosophy itself, in biology, is a revival of some of the points Aristotle was making about but now not integrating them with pre-Socratic physics, but with, post-Newtonian and indeed post-Einsteinian and, Bohrian, whatever physics. Points about, yeah, okay, there's certain things that are explained this way, and it's crucial, and all these explanations are this kind of material explaining of things is important, but it doesn't tell us everything we need to know about complex causal systems. To understand complex causal systems, including ones that don't involve consciousness, we need to make use of concepts that we understand best and derive from the case of human conscious causation. And we need to not just say, well, there's a consciousness doing this stuff, but we need to say, like, well, there's some causal structures that are analogous to certain conscious causal structures. And we need to have to understand how those function in the world and then integrate that with our understanding of the mechanical structures. And of course, the paradigm of that kind of reasoning is Darwin, who talks about how there's a principle of natural selection. Selection is a verb for a conscious thing people do, but he's not saying that, well, there's a mind out in nature that chooses. He's saying there's a force in nature that when you get variability and competition to survive, that creates a system in which there are certain pressures that function like a breeder functions when he selects for things, or like and modern information theory and a lot of kind of things that are being thought about in the context of biology and philosophy of biology can be seen as sort of uh reboots, so to speak, of an more or less successful, and I'm not sure about each of them, and I don't know all of these fields to say which ones are the best ones or not, but they're kind of a rebooting in a modern scientific context of this Aristotelian approach of thinking about the kind of causal concepts that are necessary, that we're most familiar with in understanding intentional human action, generalizing them to things that apply way broader than intentional action, but involve structure and imposition of structure within constraints that are there because of the underlying facts about the matter, and understanding a lot about even material systems in terms of the interplay of these kinds of two causal factors. And then in a context where you're doing that, you get so the claim of this kind of philosophy of science goes, a much richer understanding of causation even in totally non-conscious systems, and perhaps a way of understanding it in totally non-conscious systems that is capable of integrating how things work in the literal case of consciousness, which is, after all, some special case of this broader structural kind of causation that we're talking about.
Three things about what you just said, Greg. One is just quick to note that this point you make about Aristotle's understanding of causality and the way that he integrates various perspectives of the pre-Socratics by analogy to the role of the artist, but in a non-personal way. I mean, you're, of course, alluding to Aristotle's four causes and how he talks not just about material and efficient causation, but final and formal. And this is one thing that Mitchell's good about, that he recognizes this virtue in Aristotle. He says, in effect, that the kind of post-Baconian scientific revolution had all kinds of innovations and obvious major discoveries, but that it was too focused on the material and efficient and tried to weed out the formal and the final, and that you don't have to think of Aristotle as involving any kind of magical understanding of the world to try to explain the world in terms of final and formal. And this is the exact point you're making about Darwin and the way Darwin's implicitly relying on that. So just to flag, this is a good thing about Mitchell, that he sees this aspect of things.
I think the really important one here, actually, in a way, is formal, even more than final. Like, to get an Aristotelian understanding of causation, for better or worse, the formal cause is the most important. And that's true in Bacon himself, by the way, though maybe not in the post-Baconian tradition. And it's not true that subsequent ways of thinking about science have material and efficient causes, because you don't have the Aristotelian notion of an efficient cause unless you really have the notion of a formal cause. The formal, what an efficient cause is for Aristotle, properly understood, is a form donor. It's something that imposes form, which it has in some way on something else. So the Aristotelian understanding of what it is for something to come to be is you have some stuff that's able to be the thing that comes to be and not. And then you have something that makes it that thing by imposing a form on it. And it, in some sense, has that form and imposes it on it. And this idea of form in Aristotle is where we get the concept of information. it comes from Aristotle's concept of form. Like, that's where the FORM in information comes from. To be informed is to have a form put in you, and then information is the form. Anyway, so a lot of what Aristotle's way of thinking about science in the world is about, there are these forms that are sort of at large in the world, being pushed from one thing into another, being instilled from one thing into another. There's information flows in the world, and understanding causation is a lot about understanding, we can call these information flows or form flows, and of the economy of form moving about in the world. And insofar as you think of form as some like conscious thing, the idea of something moving around, it seems like it's primacy of consciousness and mystical, and it's hard to understand what it is. And so you think we need to do away with that. But when you do away with it too much, you stop being able to understand a lot of what happens with causation, particularly in complicated systems, and why they function the way they do. And now we know that there are all kinds of ways to physically embed ideas, in ones and zeros, in silicon, in whatever. And so you have information theory that comes out of thinking about computers and algorithms and things like this, and the embeddability of the same, in some sense, thing you might call an idea, or might be an idea when you think about it in your consciousness, in different physical systems, in letters in a book, in bits in silicon, and that the formal features of something have influence in the mechanical interactions of the thing. But if we just think about the mechanical interactions of, like, the press of the ink onto the page, you're not capturing everything that's going on in printing. Like, why are these, letters in this shape and so forth? So part of what we need to do in science is think about the information, think about the forms. Maybe we need to do that to understand causality quite generally. And then when we do it, how do we then think about consciousness as a special case of that? And I think there's a lot of areas of science where the need for this kind of a concept is becoming more and more apparent. And then there's a question of, well, how do we use it rightly? What of the Aristotelian perspective do we need to recover, and what don't we? And I think the right way to think of it historically is there's kind of arcs in science where we discover more things about stuffs and their properties and their causal powers, that enables us to explain some things we couldn't explain before, and makes us very sensitive to the power of that kind of explanation. And then there can then tend to be a tendency to overemphasize that at the expense of another kind of causal knowledge that we have, and that is actually present even in those explanations, though we tend not to be noticing it. And then at some point you get into conundrums like, well, this thing can't be possible, and yet it is. And then somebody kind of realizes that, we need to reintegrate this other kind of causation.
Yeah.
And
So
I think that's what happened in the Greek Enlightenment, and then with Aristotle and so forth. And I think it's maybe happening again now.
the second thing I was going to say, which touches on what you brought up about information, is here is another thing I like about Mitchell's whole book, which is that there's a set of concepts that are really crucial to understanding all the different phenomena he's talking about, which he's good at seeing come in different varieties, different types of generality as they apply to humans versus the rest of the living world. So the purpose and goal is one. So he's insistent that we need teleological concepts of goal or purpose to explain not just human action, but non-conscious living action. And he's good at seeing the distinctions among the types of it. Some of it's conscious, some of it's not. Likewise with concepts like information, that you can I think there's a way you could be biased in thinking that concept of information only applies to cognitive phenomena, and then be skeptical that it could ever apply to the non-conscious world. Here's a case where I think maybe the way you learn it goes in the opposite direction. It starts with some kind of concept of a form being transmitted, as he suggests, and then you come up with a cognitive version of that. He's good at seeing the variety of ways these concepts apply. And there's other examples of that in the book as well. And the third thing I just wanted to mention real quick, Greg, going back to your point about the Stoics, and we're talking about the different arguments for determinism. And you said that there were like two traditional arguments in the history of philosophy. There's the theological argument, and then in effect, the scientific argument. And it's noteworthy, I just think, from your example of the Stoics, that these two arguments perhaps aren't even as separable as one might think, because with the Stoics, right, you mentioned the interpenetration of fluids, but even with the Stoics, there's already a theological conception at work there too, because they're looking at that through the lens of Zeus and the logos and their whole kind of theological worldview. And so there's questions even there, but like, what's really doing the work?
Yeah, absolutely. The Stoics use both arguments, and they're most people in history were theists, and being having an argument from physics wasn't seen as these arguments reinforce each other.
I was curious what you guys made of his attempt to transition from quantum indeterminacy to the macro level. So there's an interesting point in that section where he talks about Newtonian mechanics and quantum entanglement. And then he makes the point that so what he says is, this is on page 164, I think, that most systems are not Newtonian in nature, that they're not linear, and that they're essentially chaotic. So he gives the example of like the atmospheric system, but he says that there are a lot of physical systems that are like that, and then obviously biological systems are an example. And he uses that to transition from the idea of quantum randomness to how it can introduce indeterminacy at higher levels. I was curious what you guys made of that point. Does that make sense of how you think about chaotic systems, and is that relevant for thinking about why we should care about quantum indeterminacy for example, thinking about biological systems?
Well, one thing I would say real quick is that I don't know how to interpret the science because I don't have the relevant scientific expertise, but his use of some of these different concepts is, I think, one of the respects in which a bit more philosophical literacy would have been helpful. Because I think that like the term determinism, for example, in philosophy means something different from what it's often used by scientists to mean. And so philosophers use it to mean a kind of metaphysical necessitation. And that's the sense that I think is at stake in the free will versus determinism debate in philosophy. Chaos theory in science, as I understand it, and maybe not everybody understands it this way, is non-deterministic in a different sense. It's non-deterministic in an epistemic sense, where there are systems you can't predict on principle because of various features of the way the probability of the systems works. And so I don't see a lot of philosophical significance for his drawing on these aspects of science. Though there is, if you understand it in the way we talked about before, where it helps demonstrate that there's no case for why science, because of some kind of certainty of prediction of the future, therefore rules out free will. But there's different senses of determinism in play here that he's not always.
So on the issue of quantum indeterminacy, I think what he says is pretty speculative, or maybe something like a promissory note for future research, because my understanding is that in there's reason to think that indeterminacy kind of cancels out, and out of a indeterminate quantum system you still get deterministic behavior. So if you wanted to take that direction, part of what you'd have to think about is, well, is there anything that would mute or cancel out the canceling out, so you could still get non-deterministic behavior out of it? So I think that is just a kind of interesting ideas, but somebody with the physics chops would have to contribute to work out how it would actually manifest in an actual theory here.
Right. because that's exactly what he argues, is that quantum indeterminacy wouldn't be relevant if what you said is true, that it's the indeterminacy just averages out, and then obviously macro level systems are still fully determinate. I was curious if, because it actually seems like, even though that
Honestly, he
section is
doesn't seem to think, like, my understanding of his metaphysical picture is that, free will aside, the future is not fully determined. He has an argument that I didn't really follow it or find it convincing. It was new, so the kind of argument he gives is new to me, so I'd have to think about it more. But that for the future, for the arbitrary future to be completely determined by the facts they are now, there's some kind of too much information would have to be contained in the present for the future to be fully determined that way. And that's a reason not to think that again, independent of the free will issue, that the future isn't determined the way determinism would have it. And I never heard that argument before, so I don't know what to make of it right now. But that's interesting, and it's certainly his view is that the future is not determined. Whether choice can, I guess, from that perspective, the question would be, well, could choice determine a future? If you think the future per se is indeterminate.
I mean, he clearly thinks choice can determine a future.
Yeah, he does, but spell out how it does it. Yeah,
but it's not. I think there are two roles here for the kind of quantum indeterminacy in the view and the kind of point that's made by chaos theory. So I think the point that's made by taking chaos theory seriously, which I think is an important point, is it gives the lie to a certain understanding of how causal understanding works and shows that another one works. You might think the reason why there's a cause that we could understand of why the atmosphere moves in thus and so way, or why a cold front comes here from there, or whatever kind of things we can understand about the system, is that every tiny part can behave in just one way, which we know. And because every tiny part can behave in just one way, the whole thing made of them can behave in just one way. And for a law to apply to a system, it has to be because each part, no matter how small, could only do one thing. But in fact, we don't know. For all we know, the parts are random, how they act within a range. And even if we know that they're determined, we don't know how they're determined. Our ability to understand why the storm moves here than there, or why it's hot in the summer and not in the winter or whatever, does not come from our ability to know what each tiny bit will do. Rather, we know about some pressures or factors that are going to influence the whole system, and we know about each bit in the system that whatever particular way it moves, it'll be part of a tendency that moves this way, right? So our ability to predict complex systems doesn't depend on our ability to predict every part. And indeed, it's not just epistemic, like the causal laws that govern the complex systems are not reducible to causal laws that govern each individual part. They could hold even if the individual parts are random within a range, or if they're not random within a range metaphysically, but we just don't know where they fall within the range, right? So that's a fact about kind of explanation and how causal laws work. Now, on top of that, he thinks that what we know from quantum mechanics is that there is a kind of randomness on the micro scale built into the universe. So he thinks that what quantum mechanics has shown us is that certain things will move, so, will do something within this statistical distribution, but it's not kind of baked in where they'll be in that statistical distribution. Is just part of the ontology. And he thinks that that's being part of the ontology is what filters up and makes room for free will in some way. So he thinks both things. But I think the first one is more important. The second one, may well be true too. In the case of the second one, it's not that it's not that the right way to understand it would be that randomness at the tiny bits filter up, but that what looks like randomness when you think about the tiny bits is really the effects of the big thing on the tiny bits, not the other way around. I think that would be the right philosophical way to understand it. But I see it as the chaos theory point is telling us something about the way causal laws function. And then the quantum indeterminacy is, then something that's added on top of that that's necessary to explain why the determinism that you might think there is of little bits doesn't rule out free will.
Yeah, and I will say I thought one of the most fascinating ideas in the book was just how he applied um, that idea from chaos theory and the idea of randomness sort of reemerging or reoccurring at the macro level to organisms. For example, where he talks about um, why variability in behavior is adaptive. And he gives the example of cockroaches, for example, that try to, they go in random directions. And that when people try to understand that in and try to predict it, you can't, there's an inherent level of unpredictability of their movements, of like how they go in every direction, and that there's an adaptive reason for that. And we already mentioned the Lebet experiments, but I think he integrates that with understanding the Lebet experiments of if you're going to make a random choice, which you need to do as an organism in random situations, you need to have some sort of source of randomness within you. I think that's his basic argument, which in our case he puts as various kinds of randomness that can have at the level of neurons firing. I thought that was a very insightful and interesting argument. Obviously, I'm not in a position to fully evaluate it as a non-neuroscientist, but
here again, I think there's it's important to get clear on some of the key concepts, because I think he doesn't often distinguish enough between, in effect, epistemic and metaphysical senses of randomness. That it's random means either that there's a kind of non-causality or non-necessity in the nature of the universe, or simply you can't predict it. And so, like, you randomly meet someone in the marketplace, it doesn't mean that there was no cause or necessity to your doing so. It just means you didn't predict you're going to bump into this person. And so it would be fully consistent with determinism if the roaches that scurry off in an unpredictable direction, there's still some initial conditions of the very little different bits that cause that, that if you knew enough about them could explain why they go one way or the other. Nonetheless, random because you can't predict it. So there's just, I think, not enough clarity on his part about which sense of those terms he's using.
Just one more thing on that, Ben, because just to be clear about what you're saying, I wonder, and point fully taken, that the philosophical concepts, I think this is what you're getting at, the philosophical concepts and the philosophical sense of randomness and of determinism are not the same as what we're talking about in these scientific contexts when we're talking about predictability. But isn't it fair to say, and maybe this is something you could say in Mitchell's defense, that the determinists are essentially giving us a sort of just so story, right? Of when they say, like, everything is determined by a prior cause, what's the evidence for that? Well, the evidence for that is that you can predict things.
Yes.
And if you show, like, well, there are actually things you cannot predict. Of course, the determinist can still just come back and say, well, there's some other feature that if you did know, it's like Laplace's demon, that if you did know that feature, you would be able to predict it. But
yeah, that's important.
Wouldn't a valid response be to say, well, now you're just giving a just so story because I keep showing you ways in which we can't actually predict it. And there are no features that you can point out to that will give you a linear outcome. And you can just arbitrarily insist that there is such. But if we're never finding it, that's relevant.
Yeah, and the just so story, as you say, is, I think, further evidence of the kind of theological style reasoning that the determinist often engages in just the same way as you don't understand how a evil God would cause suffering in the universe. Well, the theologian always has a way of coming back and saying, well, if you imagine God had XYZ property, which I arbitrarily stipulated, then it would still explain it. There's something similar in the dialectic with the determinist in the way that you suggest just now. Before we wrap up, I think there was still on the subject of philosophic concepts and how to properly understand them. One that's central to this debate is the concept of causality, and Mitchell often argues for what he regards as a kind of agent causation. And there's something that means in philosophy, and there's something he means by it. I'm not sure if they're always the same. And I know, Greg, you had some comments on this that we should definitely talk about before we wrap up.
This is about causation. I mean, yeah, I think there's one other topic I also want to just say something about when we get to about blank slates, but on causation, um, we've talked about a lot about it already. Like, how should we understand causation generally? And in philosophy, there's this dispute. Was it Chisholm or whoever wrote the famous paper on agent causation as opposed to
As Chisholm.
Event causation? There's this idea that to understand free will, right, we need to understand agents and how agents can be causes as opposed to previous events being causes. And you can think of what Mitchell is doing here is kind of picking up on that idea. This book is called Free Agents, and what is it for an agent to be a cause and for an agent to be free? And we see agent causation, what's sometimes called agent causation, at a much wider level than just people making free will choices. All living things are agents, says Mitchell, and then they're agents in different ways, and so on and so forth. And then we're off to the races getting this theory going. I think there's a kind of need for care in thinking about are there really two types of causation, agent causation and event causation? And how do you understand causation generally? Like, what's a general theory of causation that not makes room for, but because that is consistent with what we know of a human agency and what we know of the various kinds of material agency, and properly generalizes to include all of these things. And I think to do that, you have to think about entities as causes. Not like an event causation view. This thing happened and then that thing happened, but we don't have to talk about the items involved in the things happening. It doesn't work. And Jason Ryan's in his chapter on causation, on metaphysics in a companion to Ayn Rand is really good on this. That kind of picture doesn't work for understanding any kind of causation about anything once you really think about it. You have to understand entities and their features as causes. Is something also, Mike, your dissertation was about. You have to understand entities as causes. Then when you understand entities as causes, then you want to think about, and already you're understanding any entity like an atom as a cause.
You have to clarify that like a system is an entity, is an entity cause. It's not just the tiniest parts.
Right. So it's on both levels, the parts and the system.
Parts are entities and the systems entities.
And when you understand how an entity is functioning as a cause, part, but not all of what people have in mind by agent causation is involved already there in all causation once you think of things as causes of what they do. Then, okay, but there are different kinds of things, very complicated systems versus very simple ones. Systems that are alive and causally insulated from other factors in the way that Mitchell talks about, so that they're fighting entropy and so forth. Those are entity causes, but in a more narrow sense than every entity is a cause, and in a sense that involves some more of the things that we want to talk about when we talk about agents as causes. Then conscious entities that act are like a subtype of that involves some more of what we had in mind by agency, and so forth. And then, human agent and so forth. So I worry that the talking about agent cause in philosophy and also in this book on different sides of there's a ladder of from the narrowest case of human rational consciousness to the widest case of anything that causes anything, any entity that causes anything, to intermediate cases on this chain of systems and more and more complicated systems and living things and conscious systems and so forth. And agency either seems to get used for almost everything or almost nothing along this scale. And I think we need more concepts to think about the causation for the different types. And I think we want to think about entity causation, the kind of entities and powers view of causation, how that applies specifically to living systems. Maybe there's some wider type that's wider than living system, but narrower than all things. That is an important subtype here, information-rich systems or whatever it might be, and all the way up. And I don't think this book does as good a job as I'd like kind of parsing out the different types. He just uses agency very widely for almost everything.
Yeah, and I think part of what that calls to mind for me, Greg, is which I think there's a lot of good and stuff in what Mitchell is saying, is he's making the point that and I think we alluded to this earlier, that sometimes in thinking about free will there's a tendency to try to think of it as what the agent has to be, what it would have to mean for free will to exist, is that it's somehow unconnected to other causes. It's somehow unconnected to other constraints. It's somehow unconnected to a causal context. And so I think it's good that he's aware of that and addresses that. So in particular in the section where he talks about character and personality, he points out, like, we have psychological predispositions, they're like biological continuities, they're constraints, and they're genetic elements of us that create constraints on the kinds of actions we can do. That doesn't mean we don't have free will. It gives us it's actually necessary to have a particular context in which we have a range of options. But I think you had something, you said you wanted to say something about the tabula rasa idea, the idea that we're born with a blank slate.
Yeah, just this I don't think was actually important to the book, but I think it's important to the culture, and so I don't want to let it pass. So Mitchell had an earlier book, Innate, which I haven't read, and he's one of a group of people who, another is Steven Pinker, who's criticizing what they call blank slateism. The view that people are born as blank slates. But the view they're criticizing, and I think this is true of everyone who's criticizing this view that I've seen, is a straw man that was held by no one. It's the view that, entirely unlike blank slates, human beings have no nature at all. And in particular human beings are no different from one another at birth. But that's not a view that anybody held, at least anybody really important in the history of philosophy. And in particular, it's not the view held by the people who importantly pioneered and used the blank slate metaphor for understanding human beings, which are basically Aristotle and Locke. And their view, which I think is true and important, but there are important complications to it that we have to understand as we understand biology and human nature better. But their view is that human beings are born without any knowledge. And in that sense, we're like a blank paper or a blank slate, blank in that it doesn't have any knowledge written on it yet, but it doesn't have any also beliefs written on it yet that you can write in. There's a distinction between content that's learned, and there's none of that and nothing that's like that in us at birth. All of that is learned later. But of course, we're born with a nature that makes us able to learn it, like a blank slate is there with a nature that enables it to be carved on. If it was, made out of water, it couldn't be carved on. And if it was made out of something too brittle, it couldn't be carved on. And if it's, got too many blotches in it, you won't be able to read what's carved on it. And maybe some slates are better for writing some things than others or whatever. Like, all of that is, I think, inherent in and fine in the blank slate metaphor. It's not the metaphor that things have no nature. And all of the people who thought human beings were born as blank slates were aware of not just that human nature is something that gives people the ability to learn, but also some of them thought, in some cases falsely and in bad ways, that they knew about real differences between different subgroups of human beings that made them fit for things better. I mean, Aristotle, for Christ's sakes, is the pioneer of this blank slate things, that he thinks there are natural slaves and women are inferior to men in all these kinds of ways, but they're all blank slates. So the idea that blank slate goes with there's no human nature is a straw man, wrong, and crazy. Now, in its best development, or in its development in the Enlightenment under Locke, it was connected, and I think rightly connected, to a view that there's an important kind of equality among people, because what's important about us is our ideas, and our ideas aren't written on us. And so there aren't natural differences in the kinds of things we'll think, which leads to all kinds of important political implications, which I think are right and need to be preserved. And Ayn Rand herself used the blank slate metaphor precisely for this reason. That there are moral implications to the view. But the moral implications to the view are not that there can't be any innate differences between people, that everybody has to be, and there's no nature and whatever, or that men and women are exactly identical or whatever. There are kinds of differences we have and kinds of differences we don't, and all of those are worth discovering. There are facts about how we learn that are maybe innate, and maybe differences in how people learn that are to do with that. But all of that, I think, has to be integrated with an important truth that's captured in the metaphor of human beings as blank slates, the truth that we're not born with ideas in us. And there's a lot of thinking about, like, exactly what does that mean and how do you incorporate that with different funding. But I just want to since we're in a place where lots of people are railing against this blank slate idea as ridiculous, and Mitchell says it's been disproven by science and whatever, that's BS. It's a straw man. The idea that's been disproven isn't the idea that was held, at least not by anybody important. And there's something really strange and ugly about the way that people are piling on, including people who are very good in other contexts, like Pinker and Mitchell, to this fact.
And this relates to something that I said I thought was good about Mitchell, but where probably he could use more philosophic self-consciousness, because I assume part of the reason why he wants to say there's no blank slate is because he has a conception of how much is innate to our nature, and including how much information he thinks is transmitted in the history of a species uh, through evolution. And I think he's right about that if you're using information in the broader non-cognitive sense, which I think there's a legitimate use for, and he's right to see that there's a legitimate use for it. And he himself knows that there is a distinction between self-conscious cognitive information and the non-conscious kind. And so what he just doesn't seem to realize is that, as you put it, the kind of tabula rasa view in Aristotle and Locke is a view about the absence of self-conscious cognitive information that organisms don't start life with, that they have to learn. It's not a view about the absence of any of the other kind of information. And so there is just a case where more self-conscious philosophic terminology is really, I think, missing in his part.
I do think, though, that there are things to be worked out about just how these things relate. And it's not like everything that the people who talked about blank slate said was right in the way they said it. And there's no further things to learn about how the nature of our faculties relates to what we later learn. But there is something really wrong in the current culture, the current intelligentsia's discussion of innate ideas, blank slate, human nature that needs philosophical detection and correction.
Good. Well, I think this is a good place to end. Thank you guys for a really fascinating conversation. Please like and subscribe to us on Facebook and YouTube if you can. And always feel free to send us suggestions for future podcasts. Thank you all for joining me.